Hello and welcome to our next video from Billingsgate Roman House and Baths. My name is Kim Bedolf and I'm joined today by Dr Rebecca Redfern, who is a curator at the Museum of London in Human Osteology. So looking at the remains of past people in London with quite a focus on the Romans, but also quite a lot of work on medieval. Isn't that right, Rebecca?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So I'm going to stop sharing this. This is just to show you, this is Billingsgate Roman House and Baths, which we hope will be open later this year in 2021. It's been closed for a year now, which is very sad, but we hope to be welcoming you back soon. But in the meantime, Rebecca is going to talk to us this month, about Women's History Month, about women in Roman London, because we often think about the bathhouse and think, who could have used it? Would it have been the men in the house? Would it have been the women? Would it have been both? We don't really know. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and Rebecca is going to share hers instead.
Right, so today I'd like to talk to you about the women of Roman London. And there are many ways in which we can find women in Londinium, which is the Latin version of London. And so what we can look at are the archaeological evidence and the bioarchaeological evidence. So focusing on the archaeological evidence first, that's things like curse tablets, writing tablets, inscriptions, and for the most part, these are about women, or they mention women. And then we have burials of women, and then we have the bioarchaeology, so that's the human remains, so looking at the skeletons. And then lastly, we have material culture. So these are like jewelry, hairpins, clothing, things that are associated with female dress and appearance in the Roman world. The most important thing to remember when thinking about women in the Roman world is that unlike the earlier period in the late Iron Age, the women in the Roman period, they had less status than men, because in part of the Roman worldview is that female bodies have less value than male ones. So it meant that although you could be of high status, the amount of power and agency that you had was always mediated through your family. So a lot of the time women's lives are shown to us through a male gaze or through male activity. So often it's quite difficult to get into their lived experience. So beginning with a curse tablet. This one is from Moorgate, and again this mentions a woman, and it's quite vicious. And
isn't it? Wow.
It is. Yeah.
Her life and mind and memory and liver and lungs. Wow, that's pretty comprehensive.
It is, and the 7 nails that have gone through it as well. So we think that these like have a magical component to them, where the people can't get justice through ways that perhaps we would think of today, like being able to take someone to court or something. So they're seeking like supernatural magical justice, and so we find curse tablets quite often in the Roman world, particularly in places like Bath.
Yes, and so there was a lot thrown into the water, weren't there, at Bath? Yeah. Would this have been nailed to something, do you think, or would the nails just have been driven through it for, vehemence?
They're really not sure. I mean, it could have been hammered onto something, as part of like the actual act of the, to kind of like feed into the magic working. But yeah, we just don't know. But again, it's a woman who's glimpsed through the gaze and the actions of another. Although I think if she has done what she's supposed to have done, I don't think anyone would want to meet her. So from London, we also have writing tablets, and because of the Bloomberg excavations, we now have even more than we ever did. And these are really different to the ones found from the Roman fort at Vindolanda. but what I've sometimes it's interesting to think about. So you think that, you know, they're up on Hadrian's Wall. It's a place for the military, and although we know that wives and families and you know, the soldiers had personal relationships, and you know that women and children are there, you wouldn't. I find it so odd, the fact that we have more women mentioned at Vindolanda and more women writing than we do from London. So in London, none of the tablets we have are signed by women. Women are very rarely mentioned, and the vast majority are about business and about money and like the male world. So the women's world tended to be more focused on the family and their household, and be often quite local. And this, I mean, I'm speaking very generally here. There are women who were, of course, exceptions to this, but for the most part, London seems to be very male dominated, and I'll return to that in a minute with the bio-archaeology. So one of the most famous writing tablets we have is about a slave girl who originated from northwest Gaul, so northwest France. And I should say the picture is a bit of photographic magic, in as much as when you look at it, it's just a piece of wood. But when you look at it under a special light, you get the writing. So the photographer has superimposed it. So if you do decide to look this up, and sometimes some of the images don't have writing on, and that's why this is a piece of photographic magic. And so what's important here is that we not only have slaves buying and selling other slaves, but it's just, I think, you know, the language that they use about this girl. So it's like, well, whatever her name is, so whatever name we're calling.
Yeah. And Fortunata, of course, relates to being lucky, doesn't it? The name itself. So it's kind of a little bit ironic to be called lucky and be enslaved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it just shows that that, you know, she's a commodity. She has value in as much as, you know, what her service can give. And we know from elsewhere in the Roman world that female slaves were particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and also from different types of abuse that may have, you know, because they had no rights whatsoever, and that they were owned, they were property. So it's and again it repeats a lot of information that we see from other texts about the sale of slaves. So it says that she's in good health, and that she doesn't run away. So that was like your main two things: were they healthy, and did they run away? Because that's your money running.
Yeah, exactly. 600 denarii as well. And this wax tablet, because it's written in London, do you think that it necessarily means that the sale happened in London, or could it be a letter about a sale that happened somewhere else? So is this girl Fortunata, or would she have definitely been in London?
Well, we have lots of evidence for slavery coming through other means. So we have shackles, so we have restraints, iron restraints. But the difficulty with actually studying enslavement is that it is an invisible economy. So even sometimes identifying slave markets or areas where slaves might have been held before being sold are often quite difficult to actually identify without primary evidence. So it's a lot easier in the Mediterranean because places are written about, or, you know, they become, you can, like at Pompeii, where you have the actual town and you have a lot of, you know, writing and things that have survived about how Roman economics works and how marketplaces work and things. You can kind of fit it together, but in Britain it's really, really tricky. So we know that they're selling slaves to the Roman Empire before the Romans invade. And so I really, given the amount of economic activity and the amount of trading that's taking place in London, I would assume that they were selling people there, as elsewhere in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And I think again that's quite challenging, because that's just because it is side of Roman life that sometimes we don't really think about. So again, as this is a girl who's just a commodity, and for a lot of women, particularly the enslaved in the Roman world, that's just the status that they had and the world that they had to reckon with. The inscriptions are different. So in London, these are because London has no natural stone resources. All the stone has to be imported from elsewhere. It means that it was quite valuable after the Romans left. So the reason that we have these is because they've been built into something else. So a lot of the time they were discovered medieval walls, or when they're trying to stop areas flooding and stuff. So we often only have fragments of things, and again that shapes the information that we have. So, and again, they're not without problems, inscriptions in the Roman Empire. So we know that the epigraphic habit, so that's where people use tombstones to commemorate the lives of their of family members or friends who've passed away. We know that they're in this part of the empire, so in the Northwest Empire, it's particularly dominated by men, and again the military, and that probably reflects this transitory population, the fact that they want to have memories, that they want to be remembered. And it's also the use of formulaic language, so the D and the M on this tombstone, that's a shortening, saying spirits of the departed. And the thing that we have to remember with these tombstones is that the act of saying and seeing the inscriptions was part of honouring that person's memory. So they weren't just static funerary landscape. It was a funerary landscape that people had to pass through to go into the city. So people's lives and names would be remembered and would be said by people passing through. So from London, we know that they're written that women are coming up as either the people who are being remembered on the tombstone, or else they're a family member. So the one in the slide here, this is about a soldier who was in his early 40s when he died, and it's his wife who is commemorating him, and that's how we have her name. So again, we're seeing women, but again slightly at a tangent. And then we also have a very rare and very, very expensive tombstone here. So this is actually on marble. So this is imported into Britain, and it's a mother who's commemorating her son. And they think that the Eucarpia part of her name shows that the family has connections to Greece. And again, this is showing that London has people from all over the empire living there, and again it's a fact, we're seeing this very personal relationship evidenced in the tombstone, and it's very sad. She lost her son when he was an adolescent, and that must have been really traumatic and horrible, and all of that is kind of hidden behind these inscriptions, because like devoted son is often repeated in tombstone inscriptions. So again, you're kind of seeing people's lives and tragedies through a very formalized public way.
Yeah, you can learn to read these, can't you, as you say, with the formulaic kind of process of it, where you can see M at the top for Marcus, or AVR for Aurelius, and then Eucarp as Eucarpus. Phil stands for the sun, doesn't it? And then I can't quite work out that next bit, but the line afterwards has Ann, A-N-N, and then XV for 15, and then an M for month, VI for 6, and then her name. So this, yeah, there are ways and means to train yourself quite quickly to read these. But that is quite emotional, really, just looking at that. All right, so here's another inscription. This one's interesting, this one, isn't it? With Claudia Martina and her husband Anacletus being a slave.
It is, yeah, as you say, because she is a freed person, so she isn't a slave. Her husband is a slave, and it's also the fact that she's 19, and a lot of Roman women married during their teenage years. So this is, I mean, it might seem a bit strange to us today, but was very normal in the Roman world. And again, it's showing us these relationships that often aren't really talked about in Roman writing a lot, because they're not the concern of the elite males who are doing most of the writing. So it's really touching. You know, he's lost his wife, but they think that he was actually probably part of the imperial household. So although he was enslaved, he actually had a very high status and probably quite a powerful job. And again, the fact that although for us using stone is quite common, we have to remember that this was an incredibly expensive funerary monument, and we think that the flat top was actually that it had a statue on top of it, and perhaps of his wife. And again, you know, it's really emotive, because it's him commemorating her. It's the fact that, you know, he's working as part of the imperial household, so it's a way also of him being able to say his status through her monument. Because so it's like kind of expressing an awful lot of relationships and status in this one inscription.
And the reason we know that she wasn't enslaved is because she's got the two names, hasn't she?
Yeah.
Is it the praenomen and the nomen, or the cognomen?
Yeah.
I'm never entirely sure.
Neither am I.
No, but if you were enslaved, you would only have one name on you.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's, you know, if you think back to the writing tablet, people only have one name, so they have their family name, don't they? And that was again in the mother inscription, that's, you know, her family relationships, and the fact that there are these names again is showing us these status differences. So we have our view of women from the inscriptions, and again, these are very, you know, they're out of like the corner of our eye. They're women seen as either commemorating their sons or their husbands, or they themselves are being commemorated by men, and they're quite formulaic ways. Although we've got this curse tablet about a very naughty lady, which again shows, you know, that people in the past had a lot of concerns and you know, things that made them angry, like we do today. But again, it's quite difficult to build a person onto that information. So one way we can do that is through studying the skeletons. And what's really come to the fore in Roman bioarchaeology is, particularly in Britain, is in urban cemeteries there is this very large male bias, and this, we think, I mean, John Pearce has done a huge amount of work on this, and there are some cemeteries where only focusing on the inhumation evidence, so people who aren't cremated, so the burials of people, is that, again, there is this male bias. And sometimes if you look at the cremated remains, there's more women who are being cremated. But if you pull both those data sets, there is still a lot of men. And unfortunately, for many cemeteries, we know that they're only Romans, so they're from like the 1st century to the late 4th century into the early 5th. So we can't really understand what's happening over time. But there's one in London where they did a huge amount of Bayesian C14 dating. So they threw a lot of statistics at the radiocarbon dating, which then allowed them to identify more discrete periods. So they could divide it into 1st to 3rd centuries and then 3rd to 5th centuries. And this is really interesting because in the first phase, you have this 5.4 men to every 1 woman in the cemetery. And so, again, that's showing you that London, like a lot of other urban centres, is full of men, that they are the biggest proportion of the population.
It seems strange, though. I mean, I thought that it was because women were disposed of in a different way after death, potentially, than men. But to have, that kind of predominance of men over women, it seems really strange.
It is, because, I mean, for London, you have factors such as it's always had the military there. It's set up by traders and people engaged in commerce who in this period are men. They probably brought households with them. They would have had female slaves and things. But again, that is a really, really big disparity.
Mm.
And it's found elsewhere in Roman Britain. And as you say, a lot of the time we assume that perhaps rural populations would be slightly different, but that isn't always the case. But what we can see here is, so the period that once London is established and operating as a centre for the imperial administration, it's where all the coins are made, that it becomes a more normal demographic profile. So at this point, it's only 1.4 to 1 ratio, male-to-female ratio. So again, it's showing you that the people who are part of that colonizing process and part of the process of creating Roman Britain are overwhelmingly male. And the only times you tend to see this are with the expansion of other empires, like within like 18th, 19th century. You see these kind of patterns, and where they've excavated like early cemeteries in places like San Francisco and things like that, there are very few women there. And if we look at their age at death, the majority of women are dying between the ages of 26 to 35, and this seems to be similar between males and females. And they're not, in terms of stature, so that's a product of genetics as well as diet and other living conditions. They're not actually, I'm 5'4", so for me, they're not that short. But they're only just under today's average, which is 5'3".
So is that women's average stature?
Yeah, so the average stature of women in London is 5'3". So they're not actually that little.
No.
No. So again, their age, death, and their height are coming out in London as very normal for the Roman world. So in the Roman world, particularly in urban centres, you do get this slightly younger peak, and that's because at this point in Britain, urban centres are where the largest concentrations of populations are living. You have a lot of people coming in from elsewhere, bringing all their lovely diseases with them. And if you grow up in the countryside and move to the town, then your immune system isn't really prepared to take on the town's environment. So you'll have a higher risk of death because of that. And also, people are moving huge distances within the empire, so the immune system they have, which may have benefited them in the southern Mediterranean, really might not be compatible with northern Europe. So there are lots of reasons why people are dying at this age. But again, we even see this pattern into the medieval period. So again, we think this is just the nature of urban centres, and we also have to acknowledge that we might be missing a lot of people because they've moved elsewhere. So, you know, they didn't, if they survived over their mid-30s, they may have moved somewhere else, they may have gone into the countryside. So we have to be aware that it's showing us a pattern, but that pattern is influenced by many things. So they might be absent because no one's surviving, but also because they may have moved away or died elsewhere. So by looking at their skeletons again, we can see that actually Roman women in London are looking very much like Roman women across the empire. They have lots of evidence for dental caries, so tooth decay, and that's because in the Roman period, people living in urban environments had a very different diet to other places. So and particularly in London. So they had a lot of access to imported exotic things. So they had access to like pepper and cumin, and we know that they're drinking like a lot of wine, and they're using honey and natural sources of sugar like fructose, and also because they frankly didn't have toothbrushes. So they were doing the best that they could, but because of just the foods that they're eating and the fact they don't have modern dental hygiene tools, that they can't really do much. So they're losing teeth through dental decay. And then in a lot of their teeth, you can see these lines in the enamel or these spots, and that's where the enamel hasn't formed properly. And these occur as the adult tooth is forming during childhood. So although it's present in them as a adult skeleton, what you're actually looking at are things that happened to them during childhood. And we know, looking at data from before and after the Roman invasion, that the Roman period seems to be particularly unhealthy to be a child in. So we have a lot more children with things like rickets and scurvy. We know that that their diets are that they don't contain a lot of protein, so they're eating like a lot of porridges and paps and pottage, so they're not eating as much meat as men a lot of the time. And that we know from elsewhere in the empire that sometimes it was common for women to have very different diets to men. So in Italy, they found very little evidence for protein in women's diets compared to men. We see less of that in Roman Britain, but still it's evident that sex differences were occurring in diets. Their skeletons are also telling us that a lot about the activities that they're undertaking. So we're seeing bone being laid down on the inside of their ribs, and also sorry, because I forgot to put this in the slide, in their sinuses. Like us today, it's a response to air pollution. So it's where women are responsible for a lot of domestic tasks, and also people are burning oil and fats and have open fires. So the atmosphere inside people's homes is often quite heavily laden with particulates.
Yeah, and I guess around the outskirts of Londinium there were bits of industry as well, weren't there? There was glass making and things like that. Yeah, and as you say, that would have required a lot of fuel, and also to remember that, you know, London, although it's got the two hills, a lot of it is quite low lying. So, you know, and again, the fact that the houses, that it's quite a small but quite densely packed settlement at times, that again, you know, the airflow and you know, a bit like today, that, you know, areas of you know, a lot of concentrated living and things would have affected people's lives with respect to pollution. They're also, so rotator cuff disease is where you tear some of the ligaments in your shoulder, and you can either do this by accident, so you fall over and it
gets broken or ripped as part of that, or else it's from repetitive activities. Most of it is produced by repetitive activities. And again, the osteoarthritis, in women, it's a lot in their shoulder and hand joints, and that we think this is again reflecting a lot of manual occupation and a lot of manual labour, and women were responsible for processing and manufacturing cloth. They're doing a lot of domestic work. And so again, like those aspects of their lives are kind of being captured by their skeleton. I mean, as we know, osteoarthritis has a lot of causes, but it is particularly noticeable that the distribution in the skeleton between men and women is different. So that suggests to us that, you know, perhaps they're doing different things and they have different risks. So with men, it tends to be in their heavier joints, so it tends to be more in their hip and their knees, which are more load bearing. So again, it's showing us, you know, that male and female lives are quite different in this period. And we can also look at trauma as well, so things like fractures. And what's interesting with urban areas in the Roman period is that they're a bit of a hodgepodge, because your fracture risk is dictated by the environment that you live in. So an urban area will have different risk factors compared to like a rural area, although there is a lot of overlap. So the fact that, you know, you're keeping animals who may push you over and trample you in a rural setting and an urban setting. So sometimes it isn't as clear to us, the reasoning, as in later periods. But when we look at female fractures, they have a completely different pattern to the men, which reveals a great deal. So we've got a lot of accidental injuries, and these are to arm and leg bones. So these are like you're falling over and you put your hand out, or you know, you've twisted your ankle, or you know, someone's run into you, that kind of thing. And we also have, particularly in the spine, we get a lot of evidence for bone loss, so osteoporosis. We see a lot of women suffering from that, and sometimes that isn't surprising, because we know that women are experiencing a lot more vitamin D deficiency in this period, and the calcium loss kind of is related to the lack of vitamin D, which again tells us about costuming and clothing. And so because we don't get enough sunlight in Britain in the winter, we should all take vitamin D supplements, because the amount of sunlight we get and the strength of it isn't enough for our bodies to create the amount of vitamin D that we need. So because these women would have had to wear headscarf and would have had like quite thick clothing, and because a lot of their activities were inside the house, I mean, on status. So again, these women are developing osteoporosis because of it's like the cumulative effect of their diets, their childhoods, their gender roles are all kind of building into diseases you see for them in older age. We also some of the fractures we get are where the vertebral body hasn't been crushed because it essentially isn't strong enough. It's where they're getting injuries because of accidents or blows. And again, there is a lot of evidence for intentional directed violence, is how we would describe it, where you have a certain pattern of injuries that is seen time and again in the clinical and forensic literature for assault, and things like intimate partner violence, which we also call domestic violence. And these are patterns of injuries that you see across time, and
it's so sad.
It is, and again, we've got a lot of women with head injuries, and then there's the famous Calvin Wells interpretation where they're getting pieces of metalware chucked at them. in Cirencester. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy that, but yeah, you have patterns where they have a lot of injuries to their face and to their teeth, and also an awful lot of rib fractures. So you've got women who have like broken one side of their rib cage, and they also have defensive injuries, so they're breaking their arm and you put your arm up to stop your face getting hit. And we also have a lot of women where this doesn't seem to be like a one-off thing, so these are our injury recidivists. So these are women who have experienced repeated episodes of trauma over their lifetime.
That's so sad. Do you have any idea about the percentage of burial of women that have that? I know that might be difficult off the top of your head.
I do on a spreadsheet somewhere, but yeah, it tends to be. What's interesting is like at every urban centre, and urban centres particularly associated with the military, you just keep finding these women. And
presumably there's also evidence of a lot of violence between men as well, and on men's skeletons, but in a slightly different pattern.
Not always. So so it seems to be because if you beat someone because you can, because they're your slave, they will have often the same pattern of injuries as someone who's a domestic violence victim.
Right.
So it's whether the people, male and female, are victims of domestic violence, or is it because they are slaves? So it's very, very difficult to untangle. But there are, you do get the men in London, and that's what's really interesting. If you think back to Spittal, that first cohort of that first cemetery population, where you've got that 5.4 to 1 male ratio, is that they're like this subgroup of men, and they're really interesting because they a couple of them are from Italy, and they've got like broken noses, they've got broken fingers, they're like really robust guys, and they've got they've really had like a lot of injuries from like fighting and accidents, and they're all in this first phase. And so I think it tells us a lot about who is experiencing violence in the Roman world, and I think also who then is capable of perpetrating it. So we know in the Roman world that that beating your slaves and your children and your wife was completely acceptable, and that they had, compared to us, a very high tolerance for violence, in terms of that it was used as public spectacle, it was a punishment, that a lot of what we think are horrific events and horrible things happening to people were really quite normal and were normalized in the Roman world. So again, that's what, when we're looking at this, is how differently this violence was understood at the time. And then the human remains also can tell us. I mentioned that that chap from Italy. How we do that is by looking at the chemicals in people's teeth. And so where we've done this for lots of different people across Roman London, we know that women are actually really quite mobile. So we've got women who are coming from places like Germany and Central Europe. We have women coming from other areas of the continent. We've got people coming from elsewhere in Britain. And what's really interesting is that that they're telling us a different picture to the inscriptions. So the inscriptions are done by people with resources, and the skeletons that we have, a lot of the time we don't know their status, or perhaps they're buried with nothing. So it may suggest that they didn't have a lot of resources, you know, and the people burying them couldn't afford to give them a lot of grave goods. So you're getting different perspectives on Roman London according to the source, and that's why it's important to put them all together. So we know that women are mobile, And again, we have to recognise, with this being the Roman world, that this is either free or forced migration. So whether they're like the slave girl from Northwest Gaul, or if they moved with their family. And then when we've also looked at the ancient DNA, so looking at people's population relationships. So what the difference between the chemicals get in your teeth because you consume the food and water during early childhood. So that's giving you a signature completely unique to you and what you've been up to, whereas the DNA gives you more of like a depth of like that person's family and ancestry. And again, that's coming out as expected predominantly from continental Europe, southern Mediterranean areas. So essentially it's like the empire is reflected in London. And we know that by looking at people's ancestry, so we've used a forensic technique, that we're getting people who have African ancestry, and we're getting people who have mixed heritage. Again, this is really common across Roman Britain and across the Roman world. So although so London again is like today, you have people from lots of different places, and for in the Roman period that was a very normal thing to see in urban centres. So there are a whole series of burials. Unfortunately, the one I've just put up here, we don't have the person. It would be lovely if we did, but unfortunately we don't. But I've chosen this, and my colleague Frances Grew has done a blog about this one, because as I said, London doesn't have any natural sources of stone. So this lady's husband had imported this marble sarcophagus. I cannot imagine how expensive this was, from the Mediterranean. It's epic, really. But what's really interesting is that her face, although it looks like a bit mushed, it's because it's unfinished. So what they've done is that they produced these in a workshop with like a blank, and then we're at the destination, some local person would fill in the face, but that didn't happen for this poor woman. So his name again suggests with the again Italian connections, and this is a very Italian Roman Mediterranean choice of funerary monument as well, funerary choice as well. So again, it's showing us that people are making decisions about their family and about how they represent themselves with the objects that they and the resources that they choose. And then we have a lot of cremation burials and as well, and I've chosen this one who in the late 90s the media got a bit carried away and thought it was a female gladiator, which if you read the site report, they're very clear that it isn't. And they thought it was a lady gladiator, because on one of the lamps there's a gladiator, but they also have the Egyptian god Anubis on there. So and they've got these the vessels on like a pedestal. They would have been used for burning incense and things. And you have, so from this cremation barrel it's absolutely amazing. I remember when we got it all out for Roman Dead, you know, you've got burnt dates. I mean, it's amazing, you know. Wow. Like and all sorts of things. It was just absolutely incredible to see. I mean, because it's in like 2,000-year-old dates. I mean, it's just incredible. And again, you know, it's these, we get a lot of these very expensive burials that are using objects and foods that are not from Britain, that they're imported. And again, this one is unique in London. We haven't found anything like this elsewhere. And so again, this is showing us that this woman's burial was incredibly expensive. It probably reflected the status of herself and her family, and it's absolutely incredible. And the pots are these kind of muted colours because they've been burnt, so that all of that was put on the funerary pyre and then collected afterwards. So they're very good eyesight, because some of those plant material is very small.
Yeah.
Because they think it might have been a bust and burial, so where it kind of fell in, but the archaeology isn't particularly clear. So we get bust and burials. They don't seem to be. We think we found not very many.
Yeah, that's why there's a pit dug underneath the pyre, and the body and all the goods are laid out there, and then everything falls in.
Yeah. So it's kind of, so and then that gets covered over. Whereas in other cremations that we have from London, where the person is collected and then put in a vessel. So we've got a lady who is in this amazing lead vessel, and which is just amazing, because it's just like the Mediterranean world is kind of picked up and put into London. But there's Lacey Wallace's work, which has shown that for this period in London, the majority of, it's very evident that you have these communities of people from France and Germany and the Mediterranean living in London, and they're living very particular lifestyles. So they're taking their lives on the continent, picking them up and putting them in London. It's amazing. But turning to inhumations, this is one of my favourite, and this is the burial of a 14-year-old girl. So we've done a huge amount of science on this skeleton, and she was buried in Lant Street in Southwark, so quite near where the Shard is now. And this burial is without parallel in London, and although other things like the knife, you get knives in other burials in Roman Britain, and the box fittings, these are really unusual, very, very rare objects. So that knife is a clasp knife, and on top is an ivory leopard. So again, this is probably an imported object. There's a key. She has these amazing, tiny, really fine glass vessels that were placed either side of her head that probably contained perfumes and oils and things. And then then we don't have the box, but we've got the inlay, the bone inlay, showing a woman. And so by studying her skeleton, we know that she's 14 years old when she died. And then the DNA told us that she had blue eyes, and that her mother's family was from Europe. But the chemicals in her teeth showed us that she'd actually grown up in the southern Mediterranean. So this is like southern Italy. It's like all of the rim of the Mediterranean Sea. It's somewhere with much nicer weather than London. And it's a fact, the journey that she must have taken to do this, and then the objects chosen to be buried with her. It's amazing, and we think that again you get often for particularly girls who die before they're married, you sometimes get quite rich burials. So there's another lady in her early 20s from St Bart's who had this pile of copper and copper alloy bracelets on her chest and things. So she has a bell as well. So so you get these really, particularly for adolescent girls, you get these really complicated, very kind of symbol heavy burials. And then one of our most famous ones is the Spitalfields Lady, or the Spitalfields Princess. And again, this is another unique burial, and this is the sarcophagus, the stone sarcophagus, actually on site being excavated, and then this is it once it's been taken out and for analysis in the museum. And all of this was done, was filmed, and I think we had hundreds of people queue up to come and see her. And her burial is so incredibly wealthy and luxurious. So you've got this stone, which has again got to be imported into London, and then you've got this amazing lead coffin. And lead coffins, again, very expensive, because lead's got to be brought from places like southwest Britain, and it's been decorated. So these are scallop shells, and so they're used in the sand to make a mold and a pattern, and then the lead is poured in and infills it.
Right.
It's very, very beautiful design, and then inside her body, her head is resting on a pillow of bay leaves, probably inside a fabric cover. Again, and these would have been really, you know, like pungent things, and also again like the expense of them. And the grave goods are amazing, and the only parallels for her burial are France and Germany, and along like the Danube area. And so a huge amount of work has gone into her, and I think, if I remember rightly, she was discovered in 1999, because her burial was one of the questions in my undergraduate finals. I find it really bizarre that I remember watching this on Meet the Ancestors, and then I get to look after her. And
yeah, that's amazing.
It is totally
so
crazy.
Would you say, how old was she? Did you?
Yes, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
She was young when she died, but we know that her body was treated with resins, and actually on her hyoid bone, which sits in your neck, there was like this kind of yellow, it looked a bit like mustard powder attached to that, and that was the remains of a resin. So her body again had been treated with resins to make it smell, and also we know that because they displayed the dead, that would have been all part of her highly complicated funerary ritual. And then work by Rhea Brettel also discovered that that a cloth covered the burial, but it's that Tyrian purple dye, and how that was, and so that's what, we don't have the cloth, but we've got the signature of the dye. And again, she's in the base of the lead coffin, there is this plank of wood, and that was then wrapped in wool. And then the images here, this is the top one is the wool and gold thread decoration. So she's wearing this these fabric. I mean, I can't even imagine, like,
because gold thread is actual gold.
Yeah.
Twisted around a thread, isn't it? So that,
yeah,
and then you weave with that. It's amazing.
It is. I mean, and these are images under a microscope, I should say, as well. But the quality of it as well is just absolutely amazing. And the fact that, you know, that would have been, if it was something that she wore in life, just how luxurious and different that would have been to everyone else who was just stuck in vegetable dye wool.
Well, exactly, that purple dye from the little seashells from Pyrenean purple. That's, yeah. It wasn't purple I mean, it was a very special color.
Oh yes, it was, and it was only certain people and status groups could actually wear it. Yeah. And again, they think it's all part of the fact that, you know, the display aspects of Roman funerals, particularly for elite individuals. And then she also, so that picture there of what looks like leaves in mud, they're the bay leaves, and they're remarkable. I mean, because when I've been to the archive to see them, it's just they just look like they're, like, you know, like a year old or something, you know, like you would find in your garden. It's just amazing. They're just unbelievable. And then she has these, so the ring at the top and the kind of elongated triangle, that's like a hair thing, they think. So that's you know, a mechanism that she used to style her hair, but it wasn't actually in place. It was elsewhere in her burial. And then this is, and then she's got this jet rod as well, and we know that jet is it had magical properties in the Roman world, and that also because it's like electrostatic as well, it would have you know, been exotic, it would have been magical. And again, this is so incredibly expensive. And then the glass vial here, which has this amazing kind of like looping decoration, we think that the jet rod, that was inserted into it, and then it was used to like sprinkle or anoint her body. And then you have this thing that unfortunately in this picture looks a bit like a roof tile, but it's actually a canister, but it's been created out of soft arable stone as well. And it's just absolutely remarkable. The monograph on this has just come out, and it's just amazing. The objects that she has and the connections that reveals to us are just outstanding. And she's also very interesting. So there is this reconstruction that was done for Meet the Ancestors, and I've spent a lot of time with her skeleton, and I don't think her nose is that big. I feel really sorry for her, because I just think, if she could see it, she probably would have been absolutely mortified. And then I'm just waiting for some, I've just done some new DNA work with colleagues at Copenhagen, and so we're actually going to look at, because this at the time, this dates back to the late 90s, so this was kind of a lot of conjecture about her hair and eye colour, and we can get that out of the DNA now. So so we're just getting a bit more information. So although we know that her hair colour was light brown, we don't know her eye colour, but it was probably brown as well. That they're quite a common combination. So that we know that her mother's ancestry is from Western Europe. Again, that isn't really a surprise, given that we're dealing with Northern European people. She has white European ancestry, and originally they thought that she was from Spain, but the new DNA work again is kind of, it isn't showing that. And again, what we have to remember is that is DNA a very long time ago now. So the DNA techniques now are so completely different and give us so much more detail. So she was very young when she died. Again, she was 18 to 25. So again, we think it's one of these dowry burials. Right. But Janet Montgomery's done a huge amount of work on stable isotopes in Britain, that she thinks she's from Italy, and probably from like the area around Rome. So she's definitely Italian, and again has come to London. She again has, like a lot of ladies in urban centres, she's got dental decay. She's got, again, those indicators of stress. She has some early osteoarthritic changes, but really her skeleton is telling us that although she experienced a lot of things in common to a lot of people, like the childhood evidence for like disease or stressful episodes, that actually she had quite a cosseted, trouble-free life. So she doesn't have any evidence for fractures or metabolic conditions. So for her, her life was very different to, say, the slave girl in the tablet. We don't know her cause of death. Unfortunately, but it may well be, again, that if she's travelled from the Mediterranean into Britain, that she might have become ill because she just wasn't used to living in that area, or she may have been exposed to a disease or something that we haven't been able to pick up. What I was hoping is that perhaps we would pick up a disease that perhaps didn't leave a trace in the skeleton, like tuberculosis. Most people who experienced TB don't get skeletal changes, so it would have been interesting. But again, we have nothing to kind of reveal her cause of death. But her burial is absolutely outstanding, really. And once the museum reopens, you'll be able to come and see it, because all her burial is on display in the Roman Gallery, along with all our new information. And then that was it, really. And I'd just like to thank my colleagues, particularly from the contract units, like pre-construct archaeology, who were responsible for the Lant Street excavations, because the work that they did there was phenomenal, and the work of their specialists as well at Mola and at pre-construct for the interpretation of these objects and burials.
Brilliant. And I think you've got some further reading as well, haven't you?
I think I have. Yes, I do. Where are we? I do. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I just kind of put some things together. I mean, there's a huge amount of it online, and Lindsay's book is still good. And then Richard.
Lindsay Ellison-Jones, is that the first one? Yeah.
And then Richard Hingley's book about Londinium, again, draws together all of the recent information about the development of the city and who was living here and things, and that's really useful. And then there's Valerie Hope's book about Roman death. Again, that goes into more of the funerary traditions, and then I've put in the Spitalfields report. But if you go on to the pre-construct archaeology, the Lant Street site report, they have a lot of their grey literature available. And then Pierce, Millett and Struck, that book there from 20 years ago now, 21 years ago now, it deals with the dowry burials. And then evidence for the migration of women is in the paper by Shaw et al. And a free copy of that is available from Durham. And then there's the classic Toynbee publication, Death and Burial in the Roman World, again, which speaks more about status and burial.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. I think it's really interesting that through the epigraphic evidence and through the osteoarchaeological evidence and through the artifactual evidence that we've got a sense of women at every level of society. And you've actually built up quite a good picture of what life might have been like for some of these women, in some ways really, really difficult. But then there were women, as you say, that were that had a much better life. So at somewhere like Billingsgate, Roman house and baths, it's quite a big house. It's got quite a lot of rich artifactual evidence there. But again, at one of those houses, you would again have that range of different experience, because there would have been the women who were in the family, and then they would have probably owned quite a few of enslaved people, both men and women. So yes, it's really interesting though to be looking at what evidence we can see. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. No, it's always very interesting, because it means I can look at things afresh and again, you know, trying to pull the various evidence together. And as you say, that's what's lovely about Billingsgate, is that most of the evidence for Roman houses that we have are a lot of the time just marks in the ground. But the fact you have this amazing stone structure, so you can really kind of be there and imagine all the different people who live there and what their roles that might have been is absolutely incredible. I mean, it always blows my mind every time I go.
It is great. I can't wait to go back. But it's what's difficult is all of the burials, as we've mentioned before, they're always somewhere else, aren't they? We have no way of matching up who exactly was the family and other people who lived in that house from all the burials that are kind of around the periphery of Londinium, which is a shame. But there you go. They didn't say, oh, by the way, I lived on Lower Thames Street on their
yeah, sadly no. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much again, Rebecca, for coming and talking to us. You always have such a lot of information to tell us, and it's always fascinating. So thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. It's just really nice to be able to share it, since museums and you know, the bathhouse is closed. So thank you. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's very generous of you to give your time to us. So thank you. If you want to give us any feedback or ask any questions that I can then put to Rebecca, then please do get in touch. You can find us on our website is cityoflondon.gov.uk/bathhouse, and you can find our email on there. And then you can contact us on Twitter. We are at LDN for November, Roman Baths. And we're also on Facebook. So if you search for Billingsgate Roman House and Baths, then you will find us there, and you can send us a message as well. So get in touch, and we'll be there to answer any questions if we can.